So Canon have really been focusing on getting an affordable and lightweight set of primes out for their RF system. And I've reviewed every single one of them so far, and so naturally I was really excited to get my hands on the latest installment, which is the 24mm 1.8. This lens, just like the 35 1.8 and the 85mm f2, has image stabilization and macro capabilities. I did test out the macro capabilities of the 24mm. It's not a one-to-one reproduction ratio. I'm not exactly sure what it is. I'll put it up here on the screen. And it did make for some interesting photos, but it's personally not a lens I would use for any close-up macro work. It's just a little bit too wide for me. It is exactly the same size as the 35mm 1.8, which makes switching between these two lenses easy when using a gimbal, as they'll have a very similar weight distribution. And to cut a long story short, that is what I think this lens is most useful for: video. But I'll get into that a little bit later. First up, I want to talk about the build quality, and for me, this lens is definitely not super robust. If it's anything like the 35mm, which it seems it is, it's quite prone to scuffs and scratches on the exterior. It also feels quite plasticky, but it's light, and that means it's easy to carry around, which is also a bonus. The body of the lens is pretty much identical to the 35. We've got the AF MF switch, the stabilizer on and off switch, and then we've also got our focus ring as well as our custom control ring. The IS for photos works pretty well. I didn't get a chance to test it on the R6 with the R6 IBIS system and those two systems working together, but on the EOS RP I was able to get a really steady shot down to around 1/4 of a second or 1/8 of a second. So talking about image quality, the photos coming from this lens look fantastic, and they're very sharp in the center, wide open at f1.8. I would compare it to the 35mm 1.8. They're very much on par when it comes to sharpness. I decided to do a little bit of pixel peeping and checking into the corners, and found that the corners are quite soft, but this is to be expected on a compact and affordable lens like this one. I noticed that some of the subjects towards the corner of the frame look a little weird, almost like they're stretched out and not in proportion. I went to check out these shots of a brick wall that I took to test the distortion and vignetting, and switching off the camera corrections confirmed my suspicions about what is going on here. Much like the 16mm 2.8 review that I did recently, the 24mm is also doing some hefty corrections on the optics in order to create a straight and distortion-free image. We're seeing lots of cropping and straightening going on, which is causing that kind of smearing in the corners. And before all those corrections, the vignetting at 1.8 is really bad, as well as the distortion. This is some of the worst distortion that I've seen on a 24mm lens, period. I was originally kind of frustrated at this to see what they did with the 16mm with those aggressive corrections, and now bringing this design philosophy, if you could call it that, into the 24. I was kind of disappointed. And I thought, surely we can compare this to something like a Sigma 24mm 1.4 art lens and see a much better performance in the corners and in the center in terms of sharpness. But to my surprise, despite all of those corrections going on, the Canon is still a great deal sharper than the Sigma at equivalent apertures. So this is a side-by-side test with both lenses. Checking right into the corners, you can see that the 24mm Canon is actually holding up really well against the Sigma. And here in these photos of Amanda, you can see the difference between the Sigma and the Canon. The Canon is the clear winner in terms of sharpness. So despite those aggressive corrections, we still have a really good performance in terms of sharpness, even way out into the corners. It's definitely not perfect. There are plenty of other 24mm prime lenses that perform better in terms of sharpness in the corners, but it's still not bad considering the price of this lens. Because of those corrections, you still are going to be seeing that weird stretching for any of your subjects that go into the corners of the frame, so do be aware of that. The autofocus seemed fine in stills. It was very fast, very accurate. It's very much like the 35, 50, 85, the other primes that Canon have already put out for the RF system. But because I see this as a lens that could be very popular with video creators, I wanted to do a test of the autofocus system in video. So I put the two lenses head to head on the Canon R6, recording in 4K with the face tracking turned on, to see how much better this new Canon 24mm was against the Sigma 24 1.4 art, which I mentioned earlier. And to my surprise, the Sigma 24 tracked Amanda's face much better than the Canon. The RF24 was just super laggy, which was extremely weird. And as you can see in these tests, the RF lens took a little second to catch up to Amanda as she moved closer to the camera and then further away. I actually also experienced this when I was testing out the vlogging capabilities of this lens. I noticed even on the Canon EOS RP that there was a little bit of lag as I moved like towards the camera and further away. And I'm not too sure what's causing this because it doesn't really occur on any of the other RF lenses that I've tried out. I really want to test out the Canon 24 a little bit more in stills, maybe putting it up against the Sigma 24mm 1.4 art, maybe in more of a portrait style photography shoot. So if you do want to see that video, let me know down in the comments section below. So I mentioned a vlogging test before, and I actually think that this might be the best overall use for this lens, at least for the full frame RF users. 24mm, in my opinion, is the minimum field of view for filming yourself and talking to the camera handheld. And coupled with the image stabilization, this makes for quite a neat little setup. So here's some shots of me walking with the dual IS, the lens, and digital stabilization in the EOS RP. Overall, this lens is a little bit hit and miss. I know I haven't been very nice to this line of RF prime lenses, but for the price, the size, and the weight, and the fact that at least after the corrections, this lens performs pretty decently, you can't really hate on it too much. Although I will say at $100 more than the 35mm 1.8, I definitely don't see this as a more attractive option than the 35. If you are tossing up between the 24 and the 35, I would definitely go for that 35mm. It doesn't have those crazy wild corrections. The autofocus in video on that lens is also amazing, but I just think overall it's a much better lens. So who do I think this lens is for? Personally, I think it's going to be very popular with video shooters, whether it's full frame or APS-C. 24mm on the APS-C body is around a 35mm field of view, which is actually really versatile. And because it's lightweight, it's nice and wide, has image stabilization as well as a bright 1.8 aperture, it's going to be really great for doing stuff like this, recording talking head videos or vlogging. In terms of image quality, it's pretty good, but just watch out for those slightly weird stretched corners. It'll be very interesting to see if Canon continues to design its lenses like this, relying on those corrections. It's definitely a different approach to what I'm used to, and it'll be interesting to see if it's a popular tactic with more of their high-end lenses. Only time will tell. So that's it for this one. If this video helped you out in any way, leave a like down below and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one, and I'll see you in the next one.